From Hollywood, it's Out of My Mind. I'm Jay Douglas, and in episode 6, we're going from the back of your throat to backing the show to the back pages of the newspaper, and maybe the back seat of your first car. Yes, we're back, searching for the essential, non-essential, and curiously essential information that makes being a baby boomer worthwhile. And if you're not a baby boomer, you can still take part. All you have to do is listen to your local all-news radio station and complain that things were so much better when Eisenhower was in charge. Here we go. Episode 6 of Out of My Mind begins by having you raise your voice. We all want to live long and happy lives. And if we're lucky enough to do that, here's some of what we have to look forward to.
Everything becomes a little bit tougher to articulate well.
Ann Utterback, Ph.D., is a broadcast voice specialist, stress reduction counselor, and a regular writer on solving voice problems. Oh, and that pithy thought I shared a moment ago is hers, not mine.
You also might find in restaurants that you're not heard quite as well by the waiter or by your partner across the table.
I can relate to that, or at least my wife says I should. But here's my favorite.
As we get older, men's voices tend to go up in pitch, and women's voices tend to come down in pitch.
Personally, I'm not looking forward to answering the phone one day and having the voice on the other end say, "Hello, Mrs. Douglas." The same problems that affect other parts of your body, a little arthritis in the joints, the flabby muscles where your biceps used to be, play a role in voice problems such as a softer voice and slower speech.
Your lungs and your muscles that control breathing are getting a little weaker.
And believe it or not, the joints around your vocal folds, what we commonly call the vocal cords, are tightening up.
Arthritis or the calcification makes those joints a little less flexible, and that affects how they open and close.
According to Dr. Utterback, we don't have to take this silently. Let's start with articulation. For many of us, we have to slow down to form even familiar words crisply.
If you say a sentence, for instance, like West Grand Junction will be hot instead of mild next week, and you really explode those ending TD, PB, KG sounds, exaggerate them, really make a big explosion of air. That'll train your tongue to get quicker at making those sounds.
As for making your voice heard even in noisy environments, you've got to put some power behind your words. And that means no more of what Dr. Utterback calls socialized breathing.
For instance, to increase your breathing, one of my favorite exercises is just to put your hand on your stomach and try to breathe so that your abdomen goes out when you inhale and it comes in when you exhale. If you have trouble doing that or getting that sense of that, you can just lie down on your bed or on the floor, because when we're in a prone position, we always breathe with our diaphragm, which is the way we're meant to breathe. But when we breathe in our upper chest, it's what I call socialized breathing. We've been taught to hold in our stomach and, breathe up in our chest. But if you breathe with your abdomen and you take a good inhalation in and then just exhale an ah sound at a regular conversational rate, in how many seconds you can exhale that ah. You should shoot for like 24 seconds. If the first time you do it, you can only go ah for 10 seconds, try to add a second a day until you can get up to 24 seconds.
Oh, and about the reason men's and women's voices change pitch the way they do? There really isn't an exercise for that.
Women have hormonal changes after menopause. Those hormonal changes are going to affect how your vocal folds work in terms of getting a little bit thicker and heavier, which creates a lower pitch. Now, with men, the opposite is true. They don't have the advantage of some of these hormonal changes, so their vocal folds get a little bit thinner, so their pitch tends to go up.
Ann Utterback, Ph.D., is a broadcast voice specialist, stress reduction counselor, and author. And she believes the joys of living a long life don't have to be muted by speech problems. She has more advice on working with your voice on her website. I'll put a link to it in the show notes, along with an exercise you can use to learn to project your voice. Go to bit.ly/OOMM123. Click on episode 6, then follow the link to show notes. She's also written a book on protecting your voice, and I'll put a link to it in the show notes as well. Who's your favorite performer from the rock and roll era? Okay, tell me, is he or she dead or alive? Uh-huh. Just because we haven't heard anything from them in decades doesn't mean they're dead. But they could be. We need to know. To help us out, let's go to the Jersey Shore and WJRZ-FM afternoon disc jockey Bob O'Brien. Bob knows more about the rock and roll era than should legally be allowed. He's going to help us improve our rock and roll icons' dead or alive IQ. Who's first, Bob?
Well, let me throw the name Brook Benton at you, and I have a great story with this, too, is the reason I'm bringing this up. Brook Benton.
Brook Benton, okay, it's just a matter of time. He had a lot of other hits, but for me, it's the Boll Weevil song. I think 1961. He's the Boll Weevil man. He's still alive.
Well, actually, it's a strange story because I was on the air in Boston on April the 9th, 1988, doing a show, and I had just played a Brook Benton record. And out of nowhere, I just said, out of the record, I came out with something like, boy, I haven't heard from that guy in a long time. I wonder if he's touring. I wonder what he's doing. I wonder how he is. Not 5 minutes later, someone from the news department comes running in with something off the wire that Brook Benton had died. So that was the day, April 9th, 1988. And just a very memorable story because I caused it. So I've always felt that way. Oh, no, what did I do?
Promise me, Bob, if I ever make a record, you will not play it on the air.
I will not play. I will not mention you. I am a jinx that way.
I feel we have to be careful who we mention now. So I ask this with great trepidation. Who's next?
Let me see. How about Cilla Black, famous for You're My World in 1964, part of the British invasion?
I have nothing against this woman, but I have no idea. The name does not ring a bell.
I suggested that her name come up today because she sadly died over the weekend of a heart attack at the age of 72. She was only a minor star here in the States, again, part of the British invasion thing, and her song You're My World, great, beautiful ballad. She had a very powerful voice, but she was a superstar in Europe and especially in the UK. She died in Spain over the weekend at the age of 72, and it's interesting that her real name is Priscilla White, but she changed it to Cilla Black on record. It's all black and white. There was no gray area for her name. Cilla Black is gone, and a lot of people will remember her.
I'm sorry she's gone. I wish I remembered her better. All right, let's do one more.
How about Lloyd Price?
Oh, you've got personality. What a high-energy performer. Alive. No question about it. That and the fact that you would never stick me with 3 dead people on my own show.
He is actually one of the living legends of rock and roll. A guy born in the New Orleans area and now living in Westchester, New York. I got to meet him once, and he's 82 years old, and he actually had 2 careers. He started in the very early days of rock and roll and rhythm and blues, when it was still called rhythm and blues in the early 50s, and had a really big hit called Lawdy Miss Clawdy. But he had to go to Korea. He was drafted, and his career was kind of put on hold, and who knows if he would have ever made a comeback. Then there's no guarantee when you go away for a few years that you're going to come back and have hits. But he did very well in the late 50s with Stagger Lee, and you mentioned Personality, and I'm Going to Get Married, and he had a whole string of hits. So he actually had 2 careers, and he's still around, still working, and such a nice guy, 82 years old. Lloyd Price, I'm happy to say, is still among the living. But you know what a jinx I am.
And that's why we're quitting while we're ahead. That's Bob O'Brien, a wealth of knowledge about rock and roll, the stars, the music, and the era. Besides holding down the fort from 2 to 7 p.m. weekdays at WJRZ-FM, Bob, under his real name Bob Leshak, is the author of 7 books. Let's see, From Screen to Vinyl, which tells the stories of TV stars who went on to have hit records. It's got 3 volumes of Who Did It First, which are all about songs that became popular after they were covered by other artists. The Odd Couple on Stage and Screen. I'm going to put links to all his books and his website in the show notes, along with one more rock and roll icon quiz that Bob and I think is a guaranteed stumper. Let me take a minute to ask you to help support the show by helping us get more listeners. More listeners means the show can find a sponsor, and a sponsor means we'll be able to go more places and do more things in our quest to find the essential, non-essential, and curiously essential information we like to share with you every week. There are 4 things you can do right now to help. First, like our page on Facebook. You'll find us at facebook.com/OOMM podcast. Second, subscribe to the show. You can do that right from the show notes page, and it means you won't miss an episode. Third, leave us a great review on iTunes. iTunes is the #1 place people search to find podcasts, and good reviews means they're more likely to do what you did. Discover us. Finally, ask your friends to subscribe and listen to the show, and ask them to ask their friends to subscribe and listen too. Recommendations from friends is by far the leading way listeners discover new podcasts. Thank you for supporting the launch of our little program here, and thanks for helping to keep it going. In 1945, a union dispute shut down New York City's daily newspapers for 17 days. The situation was so dire that then Mayor Fiorello LaGuardia knew what he had to do and wasted no time taking action. He went on the radio and read the Sunday comics to millions of New Yorkers suffering from Dick Tracy withdrawal.
The first thing I remember reading are like Sunday comics.
That's filmmaker Fred Schroeder. And this is cartoonist Dave Kellett.
Comics tend to catch you in the intimate moments of your life. The quiet moment in the morning when you're drinking coffee or eating your breakfast, or taking a break from work, or the Sunday morning couch. These are the quiet, peaceful, joy-filled moments. And so there's a wonderful association that tends to happen with comics. And I think that has a lasting and impactful impression on your brain and on your heart.
Dave and Fred understand the hold comics have on us. They're the co-producers and co-directors of Stripped, a documentary about the decline of newspaper comic strips and the subsequent rise of comic strips on the internet. It's a topic Fred says they more or less fell into.
Originally, I wanted to make a documentary about art and artist studios, artists working in their studios. I thought it would be interesting to contrast how a painter works, how a sculptor works, and how a cartoonist works. And one of the first people I approached was my friend Dave Kellett, who is a cartoonist I had known for years. And he said, I think that's a great idea, but have you thought about just focusing on comics and comic strips? At the time, newspapers were really taking a huge hit, and that was the primary way that comics were transmitted to people was the newspaper. And there was a feeling like, if newspapers go away, where do comics go? And is there a chance for them to live somewhere beyond the newspaper page?
The short answer is yes. The internet is a viable medium for bringing comics and their readers together. The long answer is yes, but there are going to be some changes. Dave Kellett.
Charles Schulz existed because newspaper syndication worked as a business model. Robert Crumb existed because the Haight-Ashbury comics model of Northern California worked for him. It got him a living in the 60s and 70s. And so, but if you tried to make a web cartoonist now work in the alt-zine indie comics of Robert Crumb's era, they wouldn't do it. Or if you tried to have Charles Schulz working as a web cartoonist, he couldn't do it. So like every generation of art and every medium creates a different kind of artist. And so we're just having a different kind of artist emerge now.
This different kind of artist is telling different kinds of stories than the ones we grew up on. According to Dave, that's a good thing, because the stories that still stir nostalgic feelings in us weren't all that creative.
In the 50s and 60s and 70s, you started to have this blanding of entertainment because you had to speak to the 80-year-old grandmother and the 10-year-old kid on the comics page. So what you end up getting is the same stranded on a desert island joke in the New Yorker every week. Or the same, it's a kid and he's having trouble with his dog comic strip in the newspaper every week. And now you have these deeply personal stories which speak to hugely different audiences in a much more personal and impactful way than a guy stranded on a desert island comic could ever have done. So, and they're drawn better and they're technically more reproduced. And so all of that together produces a more powerful comics experience. So yeah, I think absolutely there's amazing stuff being produced right now.
These personal stories are also coming from cartoonists with different personalities than the ones who drew our favorite comic strips. Newspaper syndicates gave cartoonists such as Charles Schulz an almost monastic environment in which they could concentrate on their art while the syndicates took care of promoting their work. The internet has changed all that. Artists have to speak up for themselves. And for some, that's not what they want to do. First Dave, and then Fred.
For a lot of artists, just as a personality thing, these are people who became cartoonists because they were the shyer, quieter people. In high school, they stayed at their drawing desk and they doodled and they didn't talk to the opposite sex, and they were introspective people. And so now they're being asked in their 30s, 40s, 50s hey, turn on that charm and tell the world how great you are. And they're like, on a basic level, they're saying, no, I don't want to do that.
For a certain amount of cartoonists, the business has changed enough where it's not the same business that they
Signed up for basically. Yeah, that's a perfect way to say it.
As artists need to become more social, their stories become more social as well. Again, Fred Schroeder.
Maybe that's just the nature of 21st century existence, is it's just more social. And so you're seeing people who I think enjoy interacting with people more being drawn to comics. The prime example would be someone like Stefan Pastis, right? Who
Pearls Before Swine,
Yeah, Pearls. He does a strip called Pearls Before Swine. He started in the newspaper. He started, what about the 90s?
Yeah, late 90s. Let's say 98, 99.
98, 99. So it was pre sort of digital, transmission of comics. There wasn't really a webcomic presence at that time. And now he's sort of transitioned where he definitely has a newspaper presence, but he also has a digital presence at the same time. And I think he's been very adroit at balancing and having his feet in both places.
The newspaper syndicates that insulated the cartoonists we grew up with also exerted great influence on the stories they told. With the freedom to tell their own stories, today's cartoonists are creating strips with unique characters, surprising story twists, and cultural references that make it seem as if the cartoonist is talking to you.
Comics are eminently personal also because they are one of the last single author-driven mediums that we see in pop culture. When you go to a film, that's the result of 100 to 300 people working on it. When you watch a TV show, that's the result of 70 to 250 people working on it. When you read a comic strip, you are reading Charles Schultz. You are reading Bill Watterson. You are reading Kathy Geiswhite. You're not reading a consortium of people working on it. It's a single authorial voice speaking to you. And that's a very personal and intimate connection.
Before you shove comic strips into that nostalgia drawer next to the Lionel trains and the pop beads, remember you can still find the newspaper comics you like and discover new ones by knowing where to look on the web. Dave and Fred have tips for sites to help you out. I've put them in the show notes, along with links to where you can watch Stripped, the comics documentary, and hear the world's best cartoonists talk about the art form they love and what happens to it as newspapers die. And with that, we've drawn the last panel for episode 6 of Out of My Mind. Thanks to Dr. Ann Utterback, Bob O'Brien, Dave Kellett, Fred Schroeder, and especially you for being part of today's show. Remember to visit bit.ly/OOMM123 and click on episode 6, where you'll find all the ways you can reach me here if you have questions or comments. And click on the link to show notes for ways you can support our little program by helping us grow our audience. We'll have another show for you next Saturday, as usual, at 8 a.m. Eastern. Let's plan on talking then. I'm Jay Douglas. Out of My Mind is produced by Penny Summers and is a production of the Theater of Your Mind Incorporated, Hollywood, California.